So here's Thomas Watson once again as we draw toward the close of his book, All Things for Good. And at the moment we are in now chapter 8, and it's pages 119 to 123 in this edition that we are using. And this is Exhortations to those who are called. If you remember, Watson has worked through the fact that all things work together for good to those who love God and who are called according to his purpose. All things, the very best of things, and the very worst of things, and how that is so. He's identified the fact that this is true for those who love God, and has helped us to ask, and I trust to answer the question, whether or not we have something of that love for God in our hearts. And then he's moved on to the second part of the description. It's not separate from, but it's connected to the first. Those who are called, those whom God has effectually brought to himself by his word and by his spirit. Having explored some of that, now in chapter 8, Watson is issuing some exhortations, some stirring and vigorous calls to action, some encouragements to endeavour to those who are called. He says that if you have searched your heart and found that you are effectually called, then there are 3 exhortations that he wants us to hear and to heed. First, we are to admire and adore God's free grace in calling you. When John Newton penned that hymn, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me, he wasn't writing necessarily in the first flush of his experience, but after long consideration. And if you are a Christian, if God has called you out of darkness into his light, then it ought still to be amazing that God in his grace has had mercy upon you. And so says Watson, that God should pass over so many, should pass by the wise and the noble, and that the lot of free grace should fall upon you, that God should take you out of the state of vassalage, of slavery, from grinding the devil's mill, and should set you above the princes of the earth and call you to inherit the throne of glory. If that's gripped you, if you understand even something of what God has accomplished in you and for you, how will you not, says Watson, fall upon your knees, break forth into a thankful triumph of praise, let your hearts be 10-stringed instruments to sound forth the memorial of God's mercy. It is again that sense of who we were in our sin and who God is in his mercy, and the space between those as it's illuminated and appreciated in the light of scriptural teaching that draws forth a heart full of praise to burst out in singing. Those who are patterns of mercy should be trumpets of praise, says Watson. And that's a challenge to every person who says, I have been called by God out of the grimness and the gloom of my sin into the glory of his light, whether or not we are then speaking forth his praise. Then the second exhortation, we are to pity those who are not yet called. And I love that, not yet. It's a reminder that God is still calling and that there is hope for those who are still under the power of Satan. But says Watson, pity them. They are every day treading on the brink of the bottomless pit. And what if death should cast them in? Again, under the circumstances in which we're now living, with a pandemic sweeping the globe, how much more ought we to be conscious of how close death is eternally to those who are living in their sins still. And so says Watson, not just pity, but prayer. Pray for them, even though they curse. Pray for them as people who are morally mad, who are, if you will, demented spiritually, who do not know and do not see the truth. Wicked men are going to execution. Sin is the halter which strangles them. Death turns them off the ladder, and hell is their burning place. And will you not pray for them when you see them in such danger? Then his third exhortation, and this is the longest. You who are effectually called, honour your high calling. Many profess to be called of God, says Watson, but by their loose and irregular walking, by their carelessness and their ungodliness, they cast a blemish on religion and by this the ways of God are evil spoken of. It's one of the saddest sights, says Watson, to see a man lift his hands in prayer and then with those hands oppress, to hear the same tongue praise God at one time and at another lie and slander. I think you'd have to say, under those circumstances, whether or not the person who claims to know God and yet lives in that way is even a Christian at all. And so Watson is pressing us. If you really are a believer, then it's going to work out consistently in your life. If others are loose and vain, even if the rest of the world should live like this, even if the rest of the professing church should live like this, it is not fit for those who are truly set apart for God by effectual calling. So, says Watson, what does that actually look like? What does it mean to walk worthy of our heavenly calling? And he answers in several parts. It is to walk regularly, to tread with an even foot and walk according to the rules and axioms of the word. When we leave men's inventions and cleave or cling to God's institutions, there's a steadiness, there's a regularity, there's a stability to the way that we go through the world. Then we are to walk singularly, or we might say distinctly, distinctively. We're to not be like others. The rhythm of a Christian's tread through the world, spiritually speaking, is not the same as the ungodly. We march very much to the beat of a different drum. Watson says in civil things, singularity is not commendable, saying in effect, don't be weird. You don't have to be a freak. You're not supposed to be an oddity. There's a beauty in one sense to just social normality, but in religion it is good to be singular. It's better to be a pattern of holiness than a partner in wickedness. Better to go to heaven with a few than to hell in the crowd. If it's your godliness, if it's your righteousness that sets you apart from others, says Watson, then that is good and proper. Then we are to walk cheerfully. Well, that's a good thing for us to remember. There's no inherent dourness or heaviness and misery in true religion. There's real joy, and that joy ought to be expressed in and through our souls. Too much drooping of spirit disparages our high calling and makes others suspect a godly life to be melancholy. Christ loves to see us rejoicing in him. That's not this sort of fixed grin that doesn't have any real source behind it. You see people sometimes smile with dead eyes and you think that's not real joy. Well, this is the cheerfulness, the confidence that a Christian has that all things are working together for good. And it's a perfume to draw others to godliness. Religion, says Watson, doesn't banish all joy. There's a seriousness without sourness, and there's a cheerful liveliness without lightness. And perhaps that's something that, as Christians, we need to cultivate more of, to have that cheerfulness of spirit that bleeds out into every part of our demeanour, our disposition, and our dealings with others. Then we're to walk wisely, and that implies three things. Warily, so keeping our wits about us, bearing in mind that others will be looking for us to stumble. Then courteously, not morose and supercilious behaviour, not sneering, looking down our noses at other people, but showing a proper respect to others, yielding in things that are not important, becoming all things to all men, that by all means we might win some. And then magnanimously, we've come up against that before, not just meaning here generously so much as nobly, not prostituting ourselves to the lusts of men. And then finally, influentially, doing good to others and being rich in acts of mercy. Good works, says Watson, are not the causes of salvation, but they are the evidences. And this is the pattern of a Christian's life in the world. And this then is a rich consolation to those who are effectually called. We are called to great honour, to be co-partners with the angels and co-heirs with Christ. This should revive you in the worst of times. And I hope these exhortations have done something of that for you today.